Moving on to the next section, I want to talk about venture axioms. So these would just be some high-level rules to frame out your thinking around when you look at a company, what do you prioritize? What's important to you? Depending on where you are, I would say that this part of it is more to get you thinking. In the end, the answers and the positions that I take are philosophical. Depending on the sector and your view, you are going to have to make your own decision. So I'm going to give you some axioms, some generalized rules that I stick to when I make investments. And it's up to you to decide whether this works for you or not. So the first axiom, is deal flow more important or is diligence more important? One of the things that we hear in venture all the time, and people repeat this and regurgitate it all the time, is to say, hey, it's all about deal flow, right? It's all about having great deal flow, and that's your recipe to success. So the question here is that, do you think having great deal flow, quality deal flow is all that matters, or is the ability to do diligence to make great decisions more important? This is a philosophical question, right? For me, I lean more towards diligence. The reason is that you don't actually know if a deal is good until you've done the work. Very often, in my view, when I've talked to other investors, when they talk about a great deal, usually when they say it's a quality deal, they're usually referring to signaling value. It could be something like this company went through Y Combinator, or they have VC backing. And those data points are not without value. Sure, they could mean something, but it doesn't tell you whether the deal is a good investment or not. And it's not until you do the work that you can tell. Okay, so this is one of those rules that I think investors, one of those bad habits that investors generally have, right? We over-index on signaling value, right? You pick a shiny object, something that, something that you pick some data point around a company and to overvalue that, and it can be a big mistake to make a decision to invest on the basis of that. Next, is it about the team or idea? I think there is less controversy about this one. We can all generally agree. We pick team over ideas because ideas have no value in and of themselves, right? There's so many people on earth. There's a lot of smart people, and it's very hard to come up with an idea that's so novel and so good that simply nobody has ever thought of. But execution is super important. And so for that reason, we would rather pick a team with killer execution, with a pretty good idea, over an amazing idea, but a team that can't quite execute on it. Now, the more interesting question is that if we favor team over idea, would you pick a market over the team? Okay, so imagine that the world of startups fits in this 2x2 quadrant. On the horizontal axis, on the left is a small market, and then on the right is an absolutely ginormous market. And on the vertical axis, it's the team performance. So you have a poor team on the bottom and a rockstar team on the top. And in this world, obviously, we only care about what's on the top right quadrant, right? You want above average market size, above average team, everything else you throw away. So if you look in this space, the question is, would you pick a rock star team with a pretty big market, or a pretty good team, but operating in an absolutely enormous market? If you ask me, I would actually pick the team that is operating in an enormous market. So this button or this dot here on the right. The reason is that the axes on this chart, it's not a perfect symmetrical 2x2, right? The axes look more like this. And what I mean is that if you think about the delta between team performance, like what is a pretty good team and an amazing team? I don't know what is the difference in team performance. Maybe it's 10x, 20x, or 50x, whatever that number is. But anything beyond that number, it's hard to make the argument that team performance scales beyond 20 or 30x. But on the other hand, if you think about market size, between a big market, let's say $1 billion market, and $1 trillion market. There is 1,000x difference, right, in market size. So for that reason, if I had to pick, I would choose backing a team that is pretty good. Obviously, we want teams who can execute, but they're operating in a much, much bigger market, because then it gives them a lot more space to win. And the last one that I want to talk about is defensibility. Whenever investors get into discussion with startups, and they will always ask this question to the founders: where is your moat? Where is your source of defensibility? I think at the very earliest stages, especially where angels play, true defensibility almost never exists, very rarely. But in those conversations, what investors want to hear from the founders is to say, oh, we have patents, we have data and tech, we have flywheels and network effects, and these things constitute our moat. I guess my argument here is that I think, generally speaking, patents are something that investors overvalue, right? You could have an interesting piece of technology, you could patent it, but if somebody is infringing on it, detection is one problem and enforcement is a whole other challenge, right? Let's say you're a software company, you have a patent, and I don't know, Amazon or somebody is using your patent and you can find it. They could just drown you in lawyers and it will never get resolved. And on the other hand, things like data and tech and flywheels, these are a function of scale. So at the very earliest stages, when the company is starting out with very little traction, data and tech and flywheels, they just simply don't exist. So while this is perception, I think reality looks more like this. These bars are not to scale. I'm making a point that when it comes to defensibility, investors tend to overvalue when they hear things like patents and data and so on and so forth. But what they do, their value is actually distribution, which is why this has a bigger bar. Now, one of my favorite readings in all of venture is this article called Where to Go After Product Market Fit. And it's an interview between Elad Gil. He was Twitter's first engineering VP. He went out and started his own fund, right? And he became a solo GP. And he interviewed Mark Andreessen from A16Z. And A16Z is famously a software investor. And they were talking about this problem of defensibility. And Mark Andreessen is making the point that in software, it is very hard to stay ahead in terms of technology, software, and features, because it's just code. It's very visible. I think about an application an app that makes it big. Let's say Tinder. They invented this left swipe, right swipe type of modality for interacting with people. And suddenly all the other apps would basically copy that, right? And so that's an example of what features in software you can't lean on that for defensibility, right? It's a race to the cliff, right? You're talking about putting out killer feature after killer feature in order to stay ahead of the competition. And in the end, either you're going to have a bad streak, somebody is going to outspend you or something. But in software, what does matter is that the cost of distribution is very marginal, right? It's very cheap to distribute software because it's digital, and therefore you need to focus on distribution, get your product out, back that up with a business model that is value accretive so that you have cash flywheel to grow your business. So if you have a chance, go look up that article. I think it's quite a good one.